This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Welcome to The Commercial Investing Show, where we analyze, explain, and exploit the opportunities presented in today's commercial property marketplace. If you're interested in apartments, mobile home parks, self-storage facilities, and other income property, you've come to the right place. We'll explore what's hot and what's not in markets nationwide in the relentless pursuit of return on investment. Here's your host, Jason Hartman.
It's my pleasure to welcome Scott Krone to the show. He is founder of Coda Management Group, and they are doing some interesting and unique things in the commercial real estate space, whether it be converting old buildings, different types of buildings, to self-storage facilities. They're involved in Opportunity Zone, PACE financing, and historical tax credits. Scott, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
It's good to have you on. So give us the quick creation story, if you would, how you got started and how you've grown over the years.
I got started while pursuing a master's degree in architecture from Illinois Institute of Technology. And I was fortunate enough that my professor was a real estate developer, an architect, and builder who had a company that specialized in multifamily development. So my master's thesis was actually a 400-unit, $100 million project that was in the process of being developed. So we began developing the idea in school, which was my master's thesis. And then for the next 6 years, I worked for him both in his office and in school, and then for 3 years. And then the next 3 years after I graduated, I continued to work for him, and we were developing. So I got a real good experience on both the development side as well as the architecture and construction side. After working for him for 6 years, I began my own firm, Coda, in 1998, and we now have Coda Design Build, which is our retail, working with client side, and we have Coda Management Group, which is our investment side.
Fantastic. And you're doing some unique things in the space. You know, we've talked a lot about Opportunity Zone on the show. I think that's a little bit overhyped. You might even agree with me. But what's really interesting that you're doing is the self-storage conversion, and I find that to be fascinating. Is this all within Opportunity Zones, your historical stuff and your PACE financing, or is it just random where it depends?
I wouldn't say random. It certainly varies from project to project, but it's certainly not random.
Yeah, random is the wrong word. My apologies. It varies. Does it just vary? Yeah.
Where it really begins is when we began Coda back in 1998, we were looking at how to do things more efficient within the process, which is why we combined the development, the architecture, the build all into one company. And at that point in time, we were also looking, green wasn't really the topic or the word. Later on, with the creation of LEED, green became more of the front, or in terms of how we began talking about sustainability. And so, one of the key components of sustainability is reusing, readapting buildings. So, if we can readapt a building versus tearing something down and building something new, inherently it is more cost effective. And with the changing in the demographics, where more people are renting, wanting smaller places, moving back into the city, there's a greater demand for storage because of the fact that people just don't have they don't have an attic, they don't have a garage, they don't have a basement where they can put their stuff. And so what we're seeing is that as this trend to move back into cities, to redevelop the cities, the reurbanization, regentrification of cities, there's also this need for storage. And so what we're doing is we're taking older, empty, underperforming buildings and converting them into self-storage. And so we don't have to, rebuild the entire structure. We can buy them below replacement cost, fix them up, and get a performing asset, which is then contributing back into the community. One of the things that we have done is we've used historic tax credits. We have used PACE financing, and we've used opportunity zones where they have been applicable, and we look for those opportunities. So PACE is not available everywhere. Opportunity zones are not available everywhere. And certainly the existing characteristic of the building has to meet historic criteria. And so obviously that doesn't apply everywhere. But in the last few projects that we've done, we've been able to implement both PACE financing and the opportunity zones. And the ones that we're currently making offers on have both of those options as well.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned LEED certification. You just kind of very quickly mentioned LEED. Does LEED certification apply even to a self-storage facility, or is it just apartments and offices and things like that?
It can apply towards any type of building. It's the process of LEED is arduous in the sense that you have to begin it when you begin pre-development, if you will. And so there's a cost factor and to doing it. LEED is like the most common naming for sustainability. Sort of like when you say Kleenex, you think of a facial tissue, but because Kleenex was the first and the biggest, everyone just assumes that a Kleenex means a facial tissue. There's other companies or other programs that we have, like for instance, in the city of Chicago, they have their own green sustainable program. Energy Star is another one that we have done. So LEED is has the best branding, but they also have different criteria. So if you tried doing LEED, you would actually contradict what was in the city of Chicago, that it's not a one-to-one relationship. So they have their own standards. But when we do these things, for instance, for PACE, we're having to adhere to PACE energy programs, and we have to do an energy audit versus a standard where in order to get LEED, we'd have to do, things that don't necessarily work within our building. And so that's why we're not focusing on LEED. When we do our remodels, what we're doing is we're focusing on the requirements for PACE.
Mm-hmm. With various programs like LEED and the others, do you get better financing deals, or do you get a tax credit or anything? Or is it strictly a requirement to build that way or, renovate that way?
Well, the codes certainly require you to increase the level of efficiency within a building. With the PACE, we get more incentives because of how we can structure the capital stack. But when you do LEED, you don't get any specific tax credits or anything else that would enhance the capital stack. It's more of a branding. And obviously, the energy performance of the building should be better and will be better. But we can accomplish that without having to go through the LEED process.
Mm-hmm. And you're holding the properties, right? Is that mostly what you do, buy and hold, or buy, renovate, and hold, or do you sell them?
That's our strategy to begin with, is to hold them. But being a real estate developer, everything is for sale at the right price. And if someone comes along and offers us an appropriate price, then obviously we would sell them. Obviously, our strategy in the opportunity zones, because of the requirements of those zones, differs. But for as a whole, our strategy is to hold them, get them stabilized, maximize them, and then at that point in time, sell them off in the secondary market to the REITs.
Mm-hmm. Curious, can you teach us a little bit about how PACE works? It's interesting that in that capital stack, you mentioned off air before, that's looked at as equity because the financing goes on your property tax bill. Is that it? Versus having it called debt service? Or tell us about that.
That's correct. So in order to get PACE, you can qualify up to 20% of the after repair value of the building. So let's just take a building that's $10 million. Yeah. You can qualify up to $2 million worth of PACE approved improvements to the building. So they do an energy audit and they look at anything that is improving the level of performance of the building existing to what you're proposing. And if you can quantify an improvement there, those specific trades are qualified for PACE financing. So that could be anything from a new roof, insulation, windows, fenestrations, plumbing, electrical, elevator, any of those types of things can qualify. Inherently, the problem that we have is in the self-storage facility, we just don't have $2 million worth of items that we can justify the expenses to qualify for PACE. Typically, it's around $1 million. So once that $1 million is allocated, the financing structure is amortized over the lifespan of the improvements. So for instance, if the HVAC equipment is supposed to last 15 years, they're not going to give you a 30-year. They're going to give you just whatever the lifespan of the equipment is. Mm-hmm. And so they create a principal and interest schedule to repay it at a low interest rate. And there's both publicly and privately funded PACE programs. And they create a special assessment tax that gets applied to your real estate taxes.
Yeah.
And so you pay these payments twice a year on your property taxes. So it by definition, it becomes above the line item, so it goes into your NOI, versus after you have your net operating income, then you have your debt service.
Okay, hang on that one. Just the debt service is after the NOI. Okay, so that's not judged in a cap rate discussion. This is part of your operating expenses versus part of your debt service. So how does that affect everything, really? How does it affect the ability to get more financing later or whatever you want to tell the listeners?
Well, typically when we approve a building, the property taxes increase because the value of the building increases.
Yeah, right.
Right, but the tax rates are typically capped because you're going into the PACE program. And so the increase should balance out in terms of what your improved value would be versus what your original value would be. And so, from a NOI perspective, it should not hurt your overall value because of the fact that your property taxes should naturally be going up anyways.
Right, but it does.
So
it seems like it would hurt your cap rate because if that was just a part of your debt service cost, that wouldn't show up in your cap rate. So if you were to resell that property a year later, right, you've got this higher tax rate. I get that it's reassessed, of course, when you improve the property, but this is a greater tax burden, and it may well be a better deal. I'm just saying from the looks of the cap rate itself, that's my only curiosity.
Yeah, it doesn't impact the cap rate. What it impacts is your NOI, right? Which then impacts the value of the asset. So if your property taxes are going to be increasing without it, and the local municipality freezes that tax rate, and then you just have your special assessment, then the net gain is not much difference between if it was frozen versus if it was not frozen. And so our overall NOI does not vary too significantly. It might, maybe $10,000 or so.
What do you mean by frozen?
They cap the assessed valuation in terms of the building itself. So the only increase in the property taxes is due to the special assessment.
Right. Got you. Okay. Is that assessment that is sort of bundled in with the tax bill on PACE? I'm sure you've worked out what the real interest rate is on that. Is that the same as an interest rate you'd get on just your standard commercial loan on your first loan on the property, or is it better or worse, or how does that compare?
It's comparable to local commercial banks.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's prime plus a couple points. Okay. But the other thing about it is it's transferable. So we can assign the PACE to the next buyer. You
can't necessarily do that with a mortgage. Yeah, got it.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So that's the other benefit when evaluating the pros and cons of it. If we're selling a building now for $10 million, in essence, we can sell it for $9 million because we're giving them $1 million of financing.
Yeah. It's interesting that you're an architect, and that's perfect for a design build career, but you're also obviously a developer. And architecture is my favorite art form, or well, maybe it's not my total favorite, but it's, I think, the most impactful on our lives because we see it, we live in it, et cetera. And it's either inspiring or depressing. If you go to communist countries and architecture is just so depressing versus, more glorious architecture that inspires us, right? But when you pick a property and you're looking at what to do in terms of renovations, for example, you talked about a Milwaukee property that you're converted or are converting to self-storage. How do you make the decisions of what to do, how much to do? I've got one of my properties now, a mobile home park, and my partner and I are trying to decide, how much improvement do we want to make? It's got a restaurant on the property. Do we want to keep the restaurant, get rid of it? We're putting in some single family homes that we're, building on the property. So it's not all mobile home park lots. And we have the capital. We can spend more or less. How do you figure out the optimum amount? And that's a super complicated question, I'm sure, but any advice you have there would be great.
Well, the big thing that we always look at is, how does it impact the bottom line? Then that's where the role of the developer comes in just as much as the role of the architect. So when I was teaching architecture at IIT, and I taught it for 5 years in the second year studio, we would talk about if you draw something and it's just so elaborate or is beyond what the owner can afford to do, then it's never going to get built. And then it's just strictly a drawing. It's nothing more than a nice drawing. So true architecture is a great design that actually gets built. So if you can't afford to build it, then it's just going to stay a two-dimensional drawing. And so that's as much for me as the art of knowing how to structure the deal and knowing what can be put into it and what can enhance or improve the function, the sellability of the product as much as the design, not as opposed, but as much as the design, as well as the construction. So you really have to blend all three. You have to blend development, the architecture, and also the constructability of it. And whenever we're looking at things, we're looking at it from how is this going to impact the bottom line? My mentor, who is the president of High Point University, I'll give you an example of this. He took over the school and he's put $2 billion into the school. And part of the school is they have a steakhouse on campus. And the students can go to the steakhouse for the exact same price as the cafeteria, and they can make an appointment once a week. And, what my daughter does is she makes an appointment one week and invites a friend. The next week, her friend invites her. And they literally go every week to the steakhouse. They have a 5-star meal with multiple courses, and it's the same price as if they went to the cafeteria. The school loses $1 million annually on this steakhouse, but they view it as a laboratory to teach kids how to conduct themselves. So when they go to their interview, when they go to a job, they're not embarrassed or, they can conduct themselves in a professional manner. And so it's not new to them. So they view that cost as an added benefit to the school. So it's no different for us. When we're looking at a building, if we can add something that will enhance the value of the product and make it more accessible, make it better, then we will put that into it.
Right.
If it's just for the glamour, then we're not going to do it. Right.
Right. It's just a question of how do you know how much to spend, right? How do you know how far to go, right? You can make your storage units nicer or really basic. How do you know what will pay you back? That's the question.
In terms of storage, the difference is we need to know what configuration of lockers. We know that everybody wants clean, dry, safe, and secure. That's where we put the bulk of our money into those things. They drive into our facility, the door comes down. We're in the upper Midwest. So it gets really hot during the summer and it gets really cold during the winter. If people can come into a place, the door goes down, they can unload, they're safe, they don't have to worry about freezing, leaving their car running, other things, and they're dry, then they can operate freely. So we put a premium on that. So we don't have as much storage in the facility because we figure you have to drive the car in order to create those conditions. Mm-hmm. So those are the types of things that we put our money in and making sure that people can get in, be safe and secure. Now, once they're in, then the lockers are lockers, right? I mean, we don't have to put, fancy detailing at each of the lockers because that is not a priority for our customer. Our customers want to know that they're dry, safe, and secure. So it's understanding what your marketplace is. So if I'm looking at your mobile home park and you have a restaurant there, if you're going to go and put a 5-star restaurant there, is it going to draw people from outside the community to go there? Probably not. But would, a service, for instance, that people can, have another service like laundry or something that's going to enhance the community that draws people to it, like a park or other amenities, then I would say, yes, that's going to distinguish your community from somebody else's community. Mm-hmm. So that is the big criteria in how much more additional revenue will that bring in. And it might bring in, we have a higher occupancy rate versus a lower occupancy rate. We can get that extra 10%, so therefore it's worth it. But then what we'll balance is, okay, if we can get that, if we can increase our rates, how much more revenue is it? And does it offset itself back, reversing it in terms of what our cost is? So that's where we look at the cap rate and also what our net operating income that we can generate off of it and working the numbers backwards to determine how much we can build.
Yeah, that's all feasibility questions, interesting. What else do you want to tell people? Just anything I haven't asked you, about raising capital?
Well, I think the thing that distinguishes what we do is people think of your questions have been very architecturally based in terms of like the creativity, but there is as much creativity in terms of how the capital stack is structured. And so that's where we've looked at different opportunities like the historic tax credits or selling off cell towers or PACE financing or the opportunity zones in order to create a higher rate of return for our investors. So with the historic tax credits, we can get money back to our investors sooner when we sell the historic tax credits. When we sell the cell towers, we can return equity back faster. With PACE financing, we don't have to raise as much equity, so therefore we can increase the rate of return for our investors because we have this mezz component within our capital stack.
Mezzanine.
And obviously with the PACE is similar to a mezzanine, so you have
I'm just telling people what you mean by mezz. That's all. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, mezzanine. So, you have your equity, you have your PACE, and then you have your debt. But if our debt is still at 70%, but we only have 15% equity, we've basically doubled the amount of the return for our investors. And then the opportunity zones, obviously sheltering capital gains and diminishing capital gains altogether, and added value to our investors. And that's the thing that we did is when we first discovered that we were in opportunity zones, we just didn't create a fund to raise money. We went to our investors and said, does anybody want this? And we had people, 3 people raise their hands and said, yeah, we'd love this. And I said, okay, then we'll create it for you. And they said, well, how much are you going to charge us for doing this? We said, we're not going to charge you anything. You're already investing with us. Why would we charge you more? What we're going to do is we're going to implement this for you. And then the project will pay the accounting and all those other expenses because we're going to have to do that anyways. So we don't look at those as additional sources of revenue for us. We look at it as additional ways in which we can improve our investors' position. And that is what distinguishes how we go about our business. We're not looking for additional sources of revenue. What we're looking for is additional sources of ways in which we can improve our investors' rate of return.
Yeah, good stuff. All right. Give out your website.
Our website is CODA, CODAMG for Management Group. So that's CODAMG.com.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.